All right, well, I think we'll go ahead and get started. So this is chapter 18. A couple of you, it sounds like maybe we're on the wrong chapter for your reading, but that's okay. But it's called Revising the Song of the Vineyard. So I thought that was kind of an interesting title for a chapter. For anybody who's had an opportunity to look at chapter 18, why is it called Revising the Song of the Vineyard?
It's in there.
It's in there, okay.
I'm not sure if they're talking about Jesus revising that story, or if they're talking about the authors revising that
Yeah,
story.
so it says Jesus is telling a parable. So if
No.
he's revising something, presumably he's giving his updated insight
giving
on
them
something else that
Perspective.
has been known to the community. Something in Isaiah, okay. So you're absolutely correct, it is in Isaiah. Slides to turn.
Yep.
Okay. Yes, Jim.
This happened in the 19th century with the sharecropper system,
Mhm.
where actually the blacks were kind of like, yeah, they were technically free, but in a way they were semi-slaves.
Yeah. You're
Because they had
absolutely
to
correct.
pay-
And
They had to go to the company store.
we're gonna get to that. We're
Yeah,
gonna get to that. First, we got to find out what Jesus said.
right.
So originally, the Song of the Unfruitful Vineyard is what the technical name of it, and that's from Isaiah chapter 5, 1 through 7. And since we only have 12 verses of Mark to deal with today, we're going to go back and start by reading this in Isaiah and make some comparisons between what Isaiah said and what Jesus said. And you'll see there are some things that are in common, and then there are some things that Jesus is asking people listening to him to consider in a new way. And so this is Isaiah chapter 5. This is not from Mark. Let me sing for my beloved, my love song. And as we go through this, I want you to look at all of the individuals who are in here and the things who are in here and the places that are in here, because they're all allegorical. They're all very, very symbolic. And part of understanding the Song of the Vineyard or the parable of the vineyard is understanding the meaning of all of the symbols. And so we're going to come back and talk about that. So let me sing for my beloved, my love song concerning his vineyard. My beloved had a vineyard on a very fertile hill, and he dug it, cleared it of stones, and planted it with choice vines. And he built a watchtower in the midst of it, and he hewed out a wine vat in it, expected it to yield grapes, but it yielded wild grapes. So look at all of the things in there that Isaiah identifies. We have a beloved, we have a vineyard, we have a fertile hill, we have vines, grapevines, there's a watchtower, and there's a wine vat. All of those things are symbolic. Okay, come back to that.
And he hewed out the wine vat.
And hewed out the wine vat. I imagine hewed out means like using some kind of an instrument to cut the wood so that it's put together in the right way. Isn't that what, when you hew a tree, you're making boards out of the tree, something like that? All right. So first of all, this is kind of for Coral, since she did the scripture class with us with Chris and Jane. But for anybody else, what genre of scripture is this, Isaiah? There are lots of genres of
Yes,
scripture.
and I've forgotten
Most
of them.
There's prophecy, and there's legal things. There's law, and there are parables. So what genre of scripture
I was
is?
thinking poetry
Okay.
or parable, maybe.
Yeah, so it's just the song of,
Yeah.
of the vineyard. So song and poetry would go together. So I'd agree with that. I think you're right on top of it there. And so for our discussion, I'm going to put the questions on one side of the slide and the scripture on the other, just so we can refer back to it if you want to. All right, who is the beloved? Let me sing for my beloved my love song concerning his vineyard. Very reminiscent of the Song of Solomon. God, okay. God is the beloved, that is correct. And he had a vineyard on a very fertile hill. He dug it and cleared it with stones, planted it with choice vines. So we've got a fertile hill. Oh, and by the way, in the Old Testament, the name David means beloved. And so there were lots of gods back then that people believed in. And so this specifically is referring to the beloved as God of David, or the one true God. I thought that was important. So who's represented by the vineyard? My beloved had a vineyard, a very fertile hill.
I want to say either Israel or Jerusalem.
Okay, so it is Israel. It is the people of God. And just like we used to hear, I don't hear it so much anymore, but in this church, we talk about working in a specific area of the vineyard and talking about ministers who go out and minister to the people in that part of the world. So that's correct. The vineyard is Israel. And what does the fertile hill represent? Not quite. It's a place. It represents a place. So we're talking about the God of David, and maybe now we're thinking about the city of David. So oh, well, yeah, Bethlehem. I was thinking Jerusalem. So Jerusalem is the fertile hill. So why use this imagery of a fertile hill? Well, I'm going to show you a topographical map here. Maybe Alex or Ron, can we turn the lights down just a little bit so we can see this? It's kind of dim, So if you've ever looked at a topographical map, if you've hiked or been on scouts or something like that, you know that the different elevations are represented by all the curvy lines. And so contour lines, exactly. So each contour line represents a certain change in elevation. And you can see this is the old city Jerusalem, and the map is actually on its side, so it's facing to the right, which drives me crazy, but that's the way they printed it. But you can see that Mount Zion and Mount Moriah, and I think there's one other hill there right in the middle between the two. So there's three hills, at least three hills, surrounded by the Kidron Valley and Hinnom Valley. So Jerusalem is very much built on hills, and so fertile hill makes sense. Okay, and then of course the temple site is on top of Mount Moriah. Now these are not mountains. The change in elevation between Mount Zion or Mount Moriah and the valley is probably only 100 feet or so. So it's not like they're great big hills. They're Kansas hills.
I was gonna say, I hear.
Like here.
And I walk up to the book, I'm looking.
Okay.
So there's some numbers here.
Yeah, so if you look in the valley, the numbers are in the 600s, and if you look in the mountaintops, they're in the 700s.
See an elevation.
Yeah, so it's not a huge elevation change.
That really helps to see it.
Yeah, probably would. All right, so now we know what the fertile hill is. Let's kind of pick apart the rest of this.
I think it's better without the light on.
Yeah, you can leave it off. That's
That
fine.
hurts.
Yeah.
All right.
Yeah.
What does the watchtower symbolize besides Jehovah's Witnesses? Have you ever been visited by the Jehovah's Witnesses? Yeah, Watchtower magazines. Okay. What's the watchtower symbolize?
Heaven.
Oh, not quite.
Boy.
It's kind of our earthly, or at that time in history, it was the earthly attachment to heaven, I guess you could say.
So like the
Oh, Axis Mundi.
Hmm?
An Axis Mundi.
Axis Mundi. So actually, it was the temple, Temple of Solomon. And when they built the temple in those days, they built a tower, and the tower had little, windows, portals all around it, so that they could keep watch. And a watchtower for a vineyard would be to watch and make sure somebody's not going to come and steal your grapes or your vines or something.
books.
Fire.
What's that?
To watch for fireworks.
Or to watch for fire or whatever. It was in most cases, if you built a watchtower in those days, it had a military purpose. So it was to watch for enemies. So it kind of has that meaning too. But in the tower in the temple, and there's lots of different versions of what people think the temple looked like. This is just happens to be one of them. But in the tower version of this temple, they were not allowed to take any weapons inside the temple. That was forbidden. So nobody with a weapon opportunity to see maybe what was coming on the front. All right, so the watchtower was the temple, and I didn't put the wine vat up here. I forgot that one. So what do you think the wine vat symbolizes? This is a tough one.
A wine vat is a place where things get mixed and then they ferment. And so,
I was thinking populations.
you know,
It's where the
and-
grapes end up, and people jump in there and mash them out with their feet or whatever. And Arlene said, then it turns it into juice. And juice is fermented and turned into wine. So the wine vat actually represents the altar in the temple. So I'll give you 10 seconds to think about what would an altar and a wine vat perhaps have in common symbolically. Blood. 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 What would be the purpose of the altar, the spiritual purpose of the altar, above and beyond the physical element of blood?
where the word comes forth.
What were the people doing? How were they establishing their
Sacrificing.
relationship with God?
Making sacrifices.
Yeah, so they were sacrificing. They were trying to please God. They believe that's what pleased God. So the grapes, you bring in a bunch of grapes, they have to be smashed to give up their juice. They have to be sacrificed, but you get something good out of that. You get, it makes wine, right? So the sacrifice of the people symbolically, it's like the giving of their fruits to God. So there's a very sacrificial element here, I think, between wine vat and altar. It's kind of a tough connection to make, but I think that's where they probably were going at. And then why the grapes are wild? What does that represent? What does that tell us what's going on?
They weren't paying attention.
They weren't good grapes, were they? They were bad grapes. All right, so they weren't really fulfilling their purpose of being grapes that would be of good quality to make a nice wine, right? For the beloved, for the owner of the vineyard. So that's the people. The people were being bad. Okay, and then if the people were being bad and the beloved sees that happening, that usually when one partner in a relationship does bad behaviors and the relationship starts to break down, what are some of the feelings and emotions and things that occur as a result of that? Are the two people happy with each other?
No. Anger, disappointment.
Disappointment,
And frustration.
sadness,
Being
frustration.
cut off.
And particularly from God's perspective, being the creator of all, what one thing does God do with behavior?
Old Testament or New Testament?
Old Testament. This is Isaiah, Old Testament.
Done in.
Okay, so punishment, judgment, those kinds of things. Very good. Okay, so let's go on. And now the inhabitants of Jerusalem and people of Judah judge between me and my vineyard. What more was there to do for my vineyard than I have not done it? God saying, what else could I have done for you, you ignorant people? When I expected to yield grapes, why did it yield wild grapes? And now I will tell you what I will do in my vineyard. I will remove it, its hedge, and it shall be devoured. I will break down its wall, it shall be trampled down, I will make it a waste. It shall not be pruned or hoed, it shall be overgrown with briars and thorns. I will also command the clouds that they rain, no rain upon it. So Old Testament God made a judgment on the people, and Isaiah is pronouncing that judgment as God's prophet and saying, okay, it's punishment. You guys have gone too far with this. Everybody remember about the time in history when Isaiah was a prophet? Well, I guess we should say when, approximately what century was this taking place in?
BCE.
Yeah, it was BCE. Yeah, very BCE. So about 734 BCE, 8th century, so 700 years before Jesus or more. So this is way before anybody has thought about Jesus, probably. So what is God going to do to his vineyard? He's going to send first the Assyrians and then the Babylonians, and kind of take care of the place. So look at the picture here. What do you think about the city of Jerusalem as you see this? Looks like a big, mighty city that's being destroyed. I know it's a little hard to tell, but to me, it looks like a big city, right? You see lots of towers and lots of buildings, and it kind of is more reminiscent of what we might think of today as a very large city. I'm going to go back for a second here to this picture of Jerusalem and tell you that our concept of Jerusalem, based on the descriptions in the Old Testament and what Solomon and David did and everything, is a little out of perspective with what reality is. So here's the map. You see the legend on the lower left-hand side of the map. What is one portion? I don't know. I guess if we had this to the right size, it would be an inch. What does that equal in distance?
800 feet.
Okay, 800 feet. So ancient Jerusalem in Isaiah's time was only about maybe 5 of those, so about 4,000 feet by maybe 3,000 feet wide, 4,000 feet long. So Ron, I did the math. I think I did this right. That works out to about 11,200,000 square feet, which works out to about a little over 0.4 of a mile, square mile.
Well, change it to acres.
232 acres.
232
About the
acres.
size of a golf course.
So the 232 acres is a little bit more than a half mile square.
A little bit more than a half mile square.
A square mile is 640 acres, so a half
You
mile.
go
is
through
96.
Hamilton, Missouri a lot on the way to the farm.
Right.
How big is Hamilton, Missouri?
Hamilton, oh boy,
A number of us have been there.
I would say Hamilton, the town part. Now you get into the suburbia or the
Yeah, just the town itself.
just the town itself wouldn't be that big.
Pretty small town, right?
Yeah.
Hamilton is 50% larger than ancient Jerusalem. Hamilton is about 0.6 square miles. So I'm just saying that,
Yeah.
we have an image in our mind of what we learned
New
in
York
Sunday
City
school about
size.
what Jerusalem looks
Yeah.
like. And what I'm telling you is that the reality was that it was a very small place. It could have been fairly,
How many acres did you say that?
232.
Hamilton has grown though since Jenny joined up there.
If you've ever been to Tonganoxie, Kansas, Tonganoxie is 10 times larger.
How much did the temple
Pick up.
area take up?
I think the temples themselves, at least what they have, uncovered, archaeologists would say that the temples of that era were much smaller than, again, that we imagine. We probably imagine them to be very big, but the temple would have
Bigger than Mission Road.
probably not, maybe smaller.
Yeah, but there was a big.
Well, the courts, yeah, I mean,
Yeah.
the yard, but I'm talking about the
Yeah.
actual structure. Would not have been all that big. All right, so this is the last verse, and then we're going to move on the part. For the vineyard of the Lord of hosts is the house of Israel. Now Isaiah is interpreting for us, and we can see where we corrected. We get the correct symbolism. So the vineyard is the house of Israel, and the people of Judah are his pleasant planting. He expected justice, but saw bloodshed, righteousness, but heard cry. So we read this in English, and we understand the difference between justice and bloodshed, and the difference between righteousness and sorrow, crying. But we don't appreciate that Isaiah has slipped in a little play on words here. And in Hebrew, the word justice is mishpat. The word for bloodshed is mishpat. So the words are very, very close. Okay, and the same for the sorrow and righteousness. Righteousness is tzedakah, and crying is se'akah. Okay, And so there's something kind of interesting. There's a very fine line between justice and bloodshed and righteousness and pain and hurting somebody. And if you think about what Isaiah is trying to say here, it sounds like he's saying we might think we're doing justice, and in reality, we're shedding blood, we're not doing the right thing. We have it turned around in our mind that we're doing the right thing. We might be thinking that we're righteous people, but in our self-righteousness, we're creating pain for somebody else. And that's what Isaiah was complaining about to the people, is their lack of justice, their lack of righteousness. Questions about that? You see the relationship that we're doing to this? Yeah. Okay. All right, so let's talk a little bit about Isaiah's justice. The definition of justice for Isaiah was a fair and equitable relationship based on honesty between people. And when justice fails, what Isaiah was concerned about, it was because the economically and politically powerful had taken advantage of the weak. And there's the connection with our book. Okay, so now we're right on target with where the authors of Safe to This Mountain keep thinking of. And some scholars think that Isaiah's motivation for prophesying against the powerful was because they failed to observe the equalizing call to Jubilee. We've talked about Jubilee before. And there's supposed to be every 50 years this redistribution of land and wealth so that it maintains some degree of equity, equality in Judah. But people haven't been doing it. They're paying lip service to it and they're saying, oh yeah, Jubilee, Jubilee, but when it comes right down to it, they're keeping their land, they're keeping it. That's what Isaiah was unhappy with. All right, that's Isaiah. Now on to the revised Song of the Vineyard and what Jesus has to say about it. So you'll see some similarities here, and you're going to see some big differences. And I want, as we're going through reading, I want you to kind of park those differences in your mind. What is Jesus adding to the story, to the parable? Then he began to speak to them in parables. A man planted a vineyard, put a fence around it, dug a pit for the winepress, and built a watchtower. Pretty much similar to Isaiah so far, right? And then he leased it to tenants and went to another country. And when the season came, he sent a slave to the tenants to collect from them his share of the produce from the vineyard. So what's different in that scripture from Isaiah?
No longer the population. Well, it's no longer, they become tenants and not the owner.
Okay. So now God's leaving somebody else in charge, right? That's what Jesus is saying. In Isaiah, it was interaction between God and the people that was going on. And now God's putting somebody in God's place to kind of keep an eye on things. And then, that guy leaves, the owner leaves, and he's off doing business in another country somewhere, and sends some slaves back to collect his profits. And we'll talk in a minute about who the slaves might be. But they seized him and they beat him and they sent him away empty-handed. Again, he being the owner, God, sent another slave to them. And this one they beat over the head and they insulted him. Nanny boo-boo. Insult you. And then he sent another, and that one they killed. So each time God sends a slave to kind of check up on things and recover what the owner is owed, they're mistreating the person and even killing some people. So let's identify the characters in the story. Who's the owner? God. Okay. And whom did the owner leave to tend the vineyard? Who are those folks, the tenants? Jesus isn't here yet. I mean, in the
Israelites?
story, he's not in the story.
The Israelites?
Okay, they were Israelites, specifically which kind of Israelites? Okay, so these, and the priests, these are the clergy. These are the ministers that are supposed to be taking care of the people, taking care of the vineyard. Okay,
Is it just about the landowner?
Well, let's finish on through the story, and then we can make a decision about that, and we can decide who Jesus is accusing. So it doesn't say it, but who Jesus is talking to is the Pharisees and the priests. Right? So he's saying this parable in their presence. But we'll come back to the point there, Dennis. Who are the slaves that were sent by the owner to recover the profits from the vineyard?
I want to say prophets.
Well, that was the prophets, Isaiah, Jeremiah, Ezekiel. Yeah. So the prophets were mistreated by, God sends the prophets to the Israelites to straighten them out, and they are mistreated. The nation of Israel is not treating the prophets well. All right, we'll go on. And so it was with many others. Some they beat, others they killed. Still had he, the owner, still had one other, a beloved son. He said, okay. Here comes Jesus. Finally, he sent him to them, saying, they will respect my son. But those tenants said to one another, this is the heir. Come, let us kill him, and the inheritance will be ours. And so they seized him and killed him and threw him out of the vineyard. And now this is the wrap up. What then will the owner of the vineyard do? He will come and destroy the tenants and give the vineyard to others. Have you not read this scripture? The stone that the builders rejected has become the cornerstone. This was the Lord's doing, and it is amazing in our eyes. When they realized that he had told this parable against them, now this is the clergy, Dennis, they wanted to arrest him, but they feared the crowd, and so they left him and went away. Okay. All right, so what's different about what God is going to do in Jesus' parable compared with the Song of Isaiah?
Well, it sounds like in the Song of Isaiah that he just he punishes them, he disperses them to other places.
Okay. So God destroys the original owners.
Yeah,
And then what does Jesus add to that?
there will be other tenants.
Anybody want to speak to who that might be? The Gentiles, yeah. If you're good Latter-day Saint, it might be Joseph Smith and the Restoration that would latch on to a scripture like that. I'm not saying it's right or wrong, just saying God says, I'm going to give the vineyard to somebody else if you guys aren't going to do the job. And especially being the Pharisees and the priests. All right, so let's do a little more comparing and contrasting of the two stories. What were the differences that you saw in the two stories besides what we just talked about, what happens with the vineyard at the end? Were there any differences?
There's a change of ownership,
Okay.
or not ownership, but the change of who's guarding the gate.
Okay. And so who was it in Isaiah?
The prophet.
Who was the vineyard in Isaiah that was responsible for being a good vineyard? Yeah, it was the people themselves. It was Israel. In Jesus' version of the story, God or the owner sets up tenants, so the tenants is a new addition. So in the original story, it sounds like to me Jesus is kind of blaming the entire nation for their lack of righteousness. In Jesus' version of the story, who's he blaming now? So,
Leaders. Yeah,
so the blame has shifted. It's gotten very specific now. And instead of blaming the people, blaming the ones that are kind of in control. So does this speak any differently to justice? It's the sense of justice from Isaiah's story?
well, the owners basically rule those under them. I don't know, say that again now.
I'm just saying, does this change the sense of justice? You know, in the first story in Isaiah, God blames everybody.
Yeah.
Now, we can either assume A, that there were no good Israelites, or we can assume that B, there were a lot of bad Israelites, but there might have still been
Okay,
some good
so I'm
Israelites.
saying the powerful made the rules for the disenfranchised to follow,
Yeah.
which they didn't necessarily follow themselves.
So now it's like in Jesus' version of the story, he's going after a specific individual who are the most guilty, who have the biggest part to play in the absence of justice.
He's going after the teachers instead of the students.
That kind of makes sense. I mean, they're two very similar stories, and yet in some ways they're two very different stories. Okay, what did you see in the two stories that were in common?
Bad guys.
Bad guys, okay, there were bad guys. I would agree with that.
God's still in charge of the whole.
Okay, God still is the one that creates the vineyard.
The vineyard is still Israel.
Yeah, the vineyard is still Israel.
And the end result is
So there's still a watchtower. So the temple, okay, it's a new temple. It's Herod's temple, not
Yeah.
Solomon's temple that was destroyed. So there is a temple. There was a wine vat. So there's an altar, and there's still, we know there's sacrifices going on because Jesus has been to the temple and, you know, disrupted the money changers who were there to pay for the
and the pigeon
sacrifices.
sellers.
And what?
And the pigeon sellers.
And the pigeon sellers, yeah. Anything else?
Well, one had a head.
One had a hedge and one had a fence, okay.
So
That's
there's still an enclosure.
There's an enclosure, okay, it's like, yeah, so Israel is kind of separated from the world. It's a little kind of a gated community, I guess, we're calling our day. Offers a little protection. Think
In
about,
the end, God sends his wrath on both of them.
God sends his wrath in both cases. All right, think about the people living in these times. Think about the people in 734 BCE and the people in 30 CE. And Jesus is kind of speaking to them. You know, what we often do with scripture is we try to interpret it in light of our present situation. So how is the interpretation of these two things respective of what the people of those times would have understood?
There's still a strong man and there's still the disenfranchised.
So it reflected very much the lived experiences of the people who were hearing the stories. In Isaiah's time, it tended to be the landowners who were greedy and not complying with the requirements for the Jubilee. And in Jesus' time, now it's the clergy who were behaving badly and responsible for the absence of justice. So each story kind of reflects its own time, which I think is,
Well, and I think it still applies to our time.
it still applies to our time. And that's what the book's about, right? So that's why we're here. And they're indictments of the powerful, either whether they're wealthy landowners or whether they are the religious and social aristocracy. Changes a little bit. I mean, difference in the timeline here of about 760 years. So that's about 3 times as old as the United States is. It's a lot of time that has passed. The expectations are going to be a little bit different. Right?
Or is that used to be wealthy landowners?
The Sadducees, yes, the Sadducees tended to represent the aristocracy. The Pharisees tended to represent people who were devoted to education and the law. So you can take this with a grain of salt that I read one person liken this just to help us understand in our time that there's ways in which this doesn't work. So I'm kind of hedging myself here a little bit. But he likened the Sadducees to Republicans and the Pharisees to Democrats. There's things to like about each one. There are things to dislike about each one. But in terms of their place in society, political society, that was kind of the roles that they played. And I never really thought about it before, but in some ways it probably worked. That's not my idea. That's somebody else who. Could be Romans, yeah, Gentiles for sure. But I think in this case, we're kind of dealing with Israel, so I think he's probably more blaming those who were from Judah, who were hoarding their land or hoarding money, not willing to share it according to what the law of Moses said they should do. But absolutely, it applies to other places, and as Paul mentioned, it applies to other times, including our own. All right. How were the religious authorities in Jesus' day like the wicked tenants? What comparison is Jesus making? I think we kind of talked about that, unless yeah. They were supposed to be the ones taking care of the flock, and they weren't taking the flock. They were basically taking care of themselves. All right, I want to talk a little bit about this reference that Jesus makes to Psalm 118:22. And so that says the stone the builders rejected has become the cornerstone. So in Latter-day Saint perspective, just a second. Okay. How do we interpret that? What does that mean to us? Jesus was the stone that the builders rejected and it became the cornerstone.
Well, to me, Jesus became the cornerstone when he was the church. If we-
Y'all remember the Go Ye and Teach slides, and it had the one cornerstone in the church that was Christ? And so very much a part of restoration theology and heritage. So why are we talking about stones? Yeah. So Jesus is the rock. That's campfire song, right?
Jesus is rock that lad.
When I
That's
first
what
heard
you
that,
go
I
to
thought
write it.
everybody was saying Jesus was the rock, the rocket blast. Wait a minute, Jesus didn't have a rock.
That too.
Seeing it through the
So how is rock important in the Old Testament and particularly in the Psalms? Who's associated with the rock, not Peter? The Psalm says things like, God is the rock of my salvation. Moses hid himself in the cleft of the rock. Rock of ages, cleft in the old hymn, right?
Yeah.
So there's lots of symbolism that attaches God to a rock in a way that the rock is protected. We can hide behind it. We can maybe get away from our enemies or something like that. So Jesus is, at least Mark, I'm going to say Mark is pulling into his narrative this idea of a stone that the builders rejected as becoming the cornerstone. So now talk to me a little bit about the significance of Jesus as the cornerstone and God the rock of our salvation. What do you do for a cornerstone? You go get a big rock and you hew the rock, right?
Square it
You
up.
cut it into a square or cube,
Put a date on it.
put a date on it.
Usually the cornerstone also has a historical record.
They have a historical record in it. Okay. But Jesus is the cornerstone, God is the rock, so Jesus and God kind of the same, right?
Yeah.
What do you think of Jesus' parable, wise men? Yeah. That's another good example. Excellent example. So, in Christian theology and Christian thought, we come to think of Jesus as representative of God. God was the rock. Jesus is the hewn from the rock, a part of the rock. Chip off the old rock. That's a good one. I wish I'd thought of that. They call it pebble. What's that? They call them pebble. Pebble. Or rocky. All right. So originally we said the Old Testament talks about God being the rock of salvation, and this now is being applied by the early church, by Mark, to Jesus to help the listener perhaps understand him a little bit more. But there's an interesting thing when, we've talked a lot about translations and how sometimes the translation can misconstrue something. It can cause us to misunderstand something rather than to understand it. So in the New Testament Greek, which Mark would have been written in Greek, 12:10 does mean cornerstone, that they use the correct word in the Greek. However, in the original Hebrew of the Old Testament, which had to be translated from Hebrew into Greek for Gentiles to be able to read it. Okay, Mark was probably a Hellenistic Jew, so spoke Greek, read Greek, so he may have been writing in Greek, and it was actually a mistranslation of the Hebrew in Psalms 118. And the mistranslation again comes from a similarity of two Hebrew words. Ha'avim, the stone. That's what the Greek person who translated the Hebrew took it to mean. Haben means a boy or a son. Now that's a big difference, a stone or a young man.
That's what happens when you have bad television.
Maybe it was written by a doctor, maybe Luke wrote it. Okay. They have since found, obviously, the Greek translation of the Old Testament occurred very earlier, but one of the things in biblical scholarship that has happened since the King James Version, continue to find older and older manuscripts, sometimes just pieces of manuscripts. But we can see from those manuscripts how things may have changed, how there may have been alterations, or particularly when you have translations, differences in understanding what the words are. And so there is an older translation of the Old Testament, the Hebrew Old Testament into Aramaic, which would have been the language of Jesus. Okay, this is the language Jesus would have spoke. And Psalm 118:22, in that translation, which precedes the Greek translation of the Old Testament, says, "The child the builders abandoned was among the sons of Jesse, and he was worthy to be appointed king and ruler." Okay, so now they're saying the correct interpretation is the boy or the son. And there was more to scripture that was left out of the Greek interpretation. What is this about the sons of Jesse and was worthy to be appointed king and ruler? Who are they talking about? Yes, this is absolutely talking about David. Samuel, went to Jesse, the father, and said, "Show me your sons, and we'll find the next king of Israel." And Jesse brought out everybody but David. David was just a boy at the time, and surely my big stepping, sons who are military, some of them, next king of Israel. And Samuel goes down the line, looks at all the sons, and said, "This is not it. You have one more son." And then brought out David. Probably playing with an Xbox or something back then.
He was
whatever they did.
yeah.
So we can look at this both ways. The Christian interpretation is going to be the cornerstone. The Hebrew interpretation and the Aramaic interpretation, which very likely would have been what Jesus was referring to, again, was thinking about David. Okay. In Old Testament Israel, the heroes of the Bible were Noah, Adam, Noah, Moses, Abraham, David. So it makes sense from Jesus' Jewish perspective that he probably was talking about David here, and that Mark later on, when he adds this interpretation for the parable talking about Jesus, shares with us the Christian perspective. Does that make sense? And is there some logic to that, or do you disagree with it?
I'm reading that first, and I'm doing, why is the word builders? The builders, why would the builders abandon block? Builders abandon a block.
Well,
Like
so
that block, it's a better block.
so Mark's version says the stone that the builders rejected. Mark's the Aramaic says the child that the builders abandoned. I mean, there's similar structure there, right? Okay.
But who are these builders?
Whoever
Builder
built the
doesn't-
temple.
They're gonna abandon a rock before they're
Yeah.
gonna abandon a
Well,
child.
would the builder for this be the prophet?
Well, in the case of the child the
he's
builders
building them.
abandoned, he's talking about Jesse and people who didn't think David was qualified to be king.
Yeah.
It seems like it's just builders, because when, Israelite soldiers, like, they're the ones that didn't want to use.
Maybe this child didn't make a very good construction.
Well, you know, so David was kind of small. I mean, that was the whole point of the battle with Goliath. Here's this, you know, pinky kid going up against this great giant. So he, you know, people may have looked at him and said, you know, he's ruddy, he's redheaded,
Can't be a
he's kind
builder.
of goofy looking, and he's young, and he's kind of spindly. Maybe he's not really king material. But I'm just saying, I can't interpret for you what the person who translated these or wrote these intended. All I can, you know, share is that there is a difference in how they're understood depending on the language.
Maybe they didn't think salvation either.
I just thought that was
Yeah.
kind of an interesting point, and so I thought I would share it because it's different in scripture. And you know, and this is the way, especially dealing with the Old Testament, there's always probably going to be new insights. Archaeology brings new insights to our understanding of ancient biblical writings. And as we get more archaeology, it will either confirm or not confirm, not uphold, you know, some of the things that we thought we believed about the Bible. But I think it's important to at least be willing to consider all of the possible evidences. This is just another possible source. All right, we're going to move on to the book now, The Word in Our World. And the authors give some modern day examples of the miscarriages of justice based on the theft of the land by the wealthy. And so, Jim, here's your opportunity. If you want to talk a little bit more, I put as the first point, they talk about the westward expansion of the United States. And according to the authors, they use the statement, religion blessed American imperialism. How did that happen? How did
Manifest
Christianity-
destiny,
Yeah, manifest
that was the
destiny.
belief,
It's
but
this land is ours because God.
they
wants
kind
it
of
to
went
be ours,
around
right?
it
Right.
the wrong way by taking on to advantage of the Indians, killing the buffalo, and that was their source.
You
The
were talking a little
Buffalo.
bit after the Civil War earlier. Did you want to say any more about that?
After the Civil
Or were
War,
you talking about the Civil War and the slaves?
yeah, well,
The
after the Civil War is when there was Western expansion before the Civil War, but it really, Horace really said, "Go west, young man." So a lot of Civil War veterans, both Union and Confederate, headed west, Santa Fe Trail or the Oregon Trail, and the Indians were in the way, you know, according to them. So the westward expansion, and when Indians put on reservations, and so on and so forth.
But you were also talking, Jim, about black tenant farmers.
The sharecroppers.
Sure.
The sharecroppers.
Well, yeah, of course. It's just sort of like they were taken advantage of. It's kind of semi-slavery, I would call it. Yeah, they were free to leave, you know, but they could stay or leave. However, they were kind of pressured to stay because they bought their goods at the company store. Who owned the company store? The landowner. And so in that way, they were economically taken advantage of. Just like the poor farmers in Israel.
Another comparison that the authors made has to do with the industrialization of farming in the United States. So how did that impact individual farmers?
Ran them out of business. Continues to. Yeah, and then we come to corporate foreign owners. So they're, I mean, where my dad grew up, my uncle didn't buy all the latest machinery because he couldn't afford it. But a lot of the other farmers ended up not only farming, but working for the meatpacking industry that they had. It was farmland at one point. I think now there's a Tyson plant now, and I forget what the other one is, and the dog food plant in Denison. Kind of stinky now.
That's the other thing.
Well, back in the seventies, Earl Dutton, get big or get out,
Yeah.
and end up with a lot of small farmers.
I suppose, you know, from an economic standpoint, there's probably a financial benefit to corporate farming in that way. But, you know, it does hurt a lot of individuals. And,
Yeah.
you know, we can maybe broaden this out a little bit. I don't know much about farming, but I know what Amazon is. You know.
Yeah, that's what I was thinking
You
too.
know, Amazon and
down there.
Walmart, what did they do to the small
Yeah.
you know, business person?
One independent bookstore left in Kansas
Yeah.
City.
Hmm.
I try to go buy a book there just to keep
Rainy
them
day.
going, rainy day.
Huh?
Rainy day
boots.
books.
Rainy, oh,
So it's just, kind of
Oh, yeah,
that's,
Prosperous.
yeah, that's just kind of, I guess, the result of a free market economy. You're trying to do things for less but, you know, somebody's collecting the money from that. They're getting the benefit, and by and large, it's not the person driving the Amazon truck or the poor farmer that had to sell the farm and go work in a meatpacking plant.
Another thing has happened. High food, chicken, they basically have farmers that the farmer has a contract with them.
yeah.
They tell them what chicken, what kind of chicken, what kind of feed, basically dictate pretty much what all the farmer has to do. He takes the risk. But they pretty much find what he.
Well, and that comes back around because then they also tell them what kind of grains to plant. To send things to them and then the pesticides to use. Gets back into the soil and the soil gets back, you know, pesticides.
Well,
They
and
then they also, dictate the prices.
And
So-
if the
Damaging.
special seed happens to get into some other farmer's land, then they can get sued for using proprietary seed, even though they did not plant it.
So you're saying that the
That would be
individual peasant chicken farmer, if his birds get bird flu and he has to call the entire flock of chickens, then he takes the risk for that. He or she takes the risk for that and doesn't get reimbursed. Is that right? Dennis? So that doesn't seem very fair. And then there are a couple other examples. I agree with some of these. There's a couple of them I don't quite see. Maybe the relationship that the authors were trying to suggest, and y'all can help me understand that better. The Guatemalan Civil War, I understand that because that was from 1960 to 1996. And there were a lot of Mayan Indians, Mayans lived in the area of Central America and Guatemala, and they had their own little farming lands, and the big corporate farms came in and I killed them. I mean, actually killed them. And they said like over 50,000 of the Mayans just disappeared. Nobody knows what happened to them. So there was a lot of violence during that period in Guatemalan history. For the Mayans, probably 200,000 died altogether. So a very large amount at the hands of the Guatemalan military, primarily.
Kind of like the American Indian,
What's that?
kind of like the
Very,
American
very,
Indian.
yeah, very similar. Modern day Wild West, I guess. The Christmas War in Panama, Operation Just Cause. Anybody remember what that was about?
I forget who the guy was that took it. Oh, Noriega?
Noriega. So yeah,
Okay.
Noriega
I
was
couldn't remember
oh,
if he was
yeah.
he
Panama
was
or
I remember
the
him.
president of Panama,
Panama.
and he had kind of sort of been working with the United States, but then he started collecting money from the drug trade in Panama and identified. I think it was the first George Bush was president then, so they sent troops in to get him in Panama. So that's one that I kind of didn't quite understand completely the comparison that the authors were making. I just remember the story that Noriega was a bad person, and so the United States went in to take care of it. But I kind of felt like the authors were saying the United States shouldn't have done that. Shouldn't have been the aggressor in that situation. And then
Noriega, then in your mind, Noriega was He's terrible. That,
The bad tenant, okay, that might make sense then. We'll have to back it. Okay. And then the liberation of Grenada, Operation Urgent Fury, this was back in 1983. Anybody remember that historical event?
oh, we had students down there.
Yeah, or that was
600 maybe.
Who were we liberating them from?
Cuban.
Okay, Cubans and the Soviets. So this I remembered a little bit more about because it had more to do with what I did when I was in the military. But at that time, Grenada used to be a British part of the British Commonwealth, where they were colony, and they got their freedom sometime in the back. I don't know when it was, and Grenada was moving away from their connections with Western countries, with the U.S. and other pro-U.S. countries, working well with Cuba and with the Soviet Union, and they started building an air base that the Americans identified as a long enough runway to support the landing of large Soviet and Cuban bombers and aircraft. So we were supposed to be working with the British on this. The Queen of England did not want us to go into Grenada. She was very much against it. And Margaret Thatcher was the prime minister at the time. Both Reagan was the president in our country. And Thatcher did not want Reagan to go into Grenada. So they kind of used as the excuse
The
the medical students. We have to go liberate these 400 medical students that are in Grenada, and they promised them the opportunity to finish medical school in the United States and kinds of things. So they sent in all these forces and took over the island and liberated Grenada. And Margaret Thatcher was pretty furious with Reagan at first. They were usually on good terms, but he said, "Yeah, I sent you an email or something," and she didn't get it. I don't know. Apparently, Margaret didn't know about this, and she was very upset that the United States would take this. And so I guess the point is, we had an objective that was not legitimate. Still kind of in that era of trying to spread the threat of communism, the spread of communism like we did in Vietnam and other places.
Well, the Cold War had got pretty hot
Yeah.
at that point in time too.
Turn down this hall.
So I guess the point is there, they felt that the United States was the aggressor, the unjust tenant or whatever, going in and trying to fix something. Fixing. Guess how you see it. It is a little harder to understand. I like the westward expansion. I can understand that in the industrialization farming.
I was in Germany that year, and I heard it from the Germans' perspective. And I didn't follow it well enough, but I do remember that was also the time when the Americans were putting the Patriot missiles in Germany. And the Germans did not want it. They thought of Americans as just these imperialistic bullies. It's like, stay out of our country, so they invited me to go protest.
Oh.
I decided not to go because I thought I'd probably be deported.
Yeah.
That'd be a good idea.
But that was they were definitely against the invasion.
So I think overall the point is well taken. Mark is talking about people who are abusing the system, and the injustice is played out in the lives of the poor and the marginalized again. This is chapter 18. We've had 1,700 chapters that kind of told us the same thing. I think most of the parallels that I can see.
I was gonna say the British in India might be a better example.
Yeah.
Up there. More clear. Then again, further back in history, a little more clarity comes through.
Yeah, I remember I forget if he was the prime minister or the governor of India at the time, and they had that shooting where a lot of civilians were killed.
Massacred.
And he's asking the general, he says, "Why did you open fire on this crowd? What did you do with the wounded?" And he says, "We offered to render assistance to all who applied." And he says, "How does a child who's been shot with a .303 Enfield apply to him?" you know, it's sometimes our images in our mind, but you know, that's the difference between justice and bloodshed. We think we're being just, but we're not fixing bloodshed.
A lot of that western expansion also happened when somebody found where there was gold in the Dollar Hills.
All right, well, for the first time in a long time, I've actually finished the class. Next week, chapter 19, arguing scripture, Mark 12,
Are you
18
next
to
week?
13.
Dennis, who's next?